All right, welcome everyone on today's episode of the Pipeline Report. Are we on the brink of war? We have major disputes going on in Mexico between the cartel and the Mexican government, with a possible partnership being reported, and more so a partnership being reported with U.S. military assets in Mexico as they took out a major cartel leader. Then we have buildup of military assets in the Middle East as we get ready for the State of the Union this week. We'll discuss all this and more, and the importance and significance for those of us who are prayer warriors and watchmen on the wall as we go to today's episode on the Pipeline Report. It'll just be me today as Pastor Tim is traveling back from California as he's been with Pastor Regis on their anniversary weekend for their ministry and for themselves as pastors. So join me today on today's episode of the Pipeline Report as we dive into today's news and more. Welcome everyone. Flying solo today, so I'm going to try to get everything set up here to be watching the chats. Leave your comments in the chat section on Rumble, Facebook, and YouTube, and I'll be sure to pay attention to those and answer any questions that may come through. Again, as I said in the intro, Pastor Jim is in California, so we'll be flying solo today, and he'll also be getting ready for his trip to Ireland as they get ready for their Thin Places tour. So it'll just be me here the next couple weeks, and make sure we're following along as things are starting to heat up both here domestically and around the world, as we've had some major rulings that happened. Actually, one that just came out, Trump was speaking up about in regards to birthright citizenships and injunctions from judges and lower court judges and stuff that actually ruled in the favor from what I'm understanding. So this is news as it's happening live in the moment here. But what we're going to do here is kind of touch back on some things that have happened over the weekend that are very significant to what we do here in praying for the office of the president and leaders and those looking out into the political spectrum and then the spiritual realm of how we can pray for our leaders even when we agree and or don't agree with them, as we did with President Biden and now we do with President Trump. So first off, we're seeing a major news report coming out. I want to touch on the issue of what's been happening in Mexico. We have the U.S. Embassy telling Americans to shelter in place as the Mexican government has partnered in training with U.S. forces to take out a cartel leader. And you're seeing videos come out. And I think one of the better ones was from Dan Crenshaw, who put out this message of saying, ultimately, this is the beginning of war against the most violent and deranged cartel in Mexico, El Cartel, going through Jalisco Nueva Generacion, or CJ&J, or G, excuse me, in taking the leader El Mincho, was killed yesterday by Mexican Special Forces using U.S. intelligence. So there's a partnership there. The CJ&G was discussing here in this video about how they're possibly going to come after the U.S. What does that mean on the U.S. border, the southern border, etc., things like that, as we've seen tensions somewhat simmer down as far as the crossings and DHS stepping up and allowing Border Patrol to do its job there. So there's a lot happening here. And then there's this report from Fox News yesterday that I want to play that really discusses, I want to make sure it's up here, and let me know if you have sound, that really plays this out. And the reason I want to play this, because it shows the areas, the tourist areas, but in other regions within Mexico as firefights have started all throughout Mexico. But it shows the map here that here Faulkner here shows. But so let's listen to this, and then
the U.S. State Department is telling Americans in Mexico to shelter in place as law enforcement tries to regain control of cities that have fallen into chaos in the hands of the Mexican cartels. This is after the Mexican military took out a notorious cartel kingpin with U.S. support. And we're learning a little bit more about our role in all of that.
So we're seeing here on this map, for those watching live and even on replay here, you see up here the Baja California right there. That's an area in Tijuana, and those tourist areas that are there. And even in Guadalajara down here, I saw some videos of people in airports having to shelter in places. There's a gunman on the runway, and just other videos, gas stations. I mean, just indiscriminate going after tourist areas, which has been kind of a area of concern for a lot of people. You even have Cancun there, Cozumel, major tourist areas, and even along the coastline there in the south of Mexico. So we're seeing these areas be hit hard. Now the question is, what does this mean for southern border states? California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, there, Arizona, not Nevada. And so we're seeing this play out live here happening yesterday. And one of the things we need to, continue to pray for is obviously those who live along the border, but then also the administration and DHS. And what is something we really want to take into effect is we're talking about DHS being shut down, hits its 10th day as they're still negotiating how much money needs to go to them and be appropriated, et cetera, through these funding bills that have been happening. This is all kind of coming full circle. So was this done in coordination with that? Does now the cartel, do they look at taking a pot shot at the United States through this, knowing that there's not funding going on, there's possibly a wink link there, which could turn out to be a mistake from this administration and DHS itself of leaving the southern border there kind of shorthanded to an effect. So we really want to make sure that we're praying for this administration through this issue on the Mexico issue and the southern border, and really making sure the military, families and people who are there are protected spiritually as well as naturally, in making sure these threats that have been warned about for quite a while hopefully don't play through. And the Mexican government is kind of waffling, and they're going through their own battle, because there's even some Mexican senators who are talking about the ties between the cartel and the governments. And so you're seeing an exposure of things happening. Obviously, this is all fallout from what happened with Venezuela. Quite interesting to see just how far-reaching and far-affecting that decision was. Now we have to see what plays out here, how effective can the Mexican government be in eradicating some of these ties that are being publicized now between the cartel and certain Mexican government officials. And then the bigger question that is being asked, and I think needs to be answered, which is, how high up the ranks does it go? Is it just, low level, or is it as high level as the Mexican president? Yet to be seen, yet to know. I know there's a lot of speculations about things out there. And this thing, either it'll be uncovered or it won't. But I think this is the far-reaching tentacles of the effects of taking out Maduro in the middle of the night and kind of resetting things here on the Western Hemisphere with the Don Roe doctrine, as we've talked about in the past couple of weeks. Okay. Moving on. Want to talk about a little bit Israel is affected here, but then also in Iran. President Trump has sent more assets. He's created a harder deadline, which can be a good thing if he follows through, but then it also discusses does this mean troops on the ground with Iran? We've seen, and we've talked about this before, is the ramping up, and I'll show this picture here of what's going on in the Middle East and where the assets are really being positioned, as we're seeing more and more aircrafts go there in Syria, Iraq, right there in Syria, Jordan border. You have some destroyers there right by Saudi Arabia. You have lots within the Strait of Hormuz by the UAE. EA on the other side of Saudi Arabia, right by Iran. And then some here, Abraham Lincoln sitting out here by Oman. So we see this build up here. I know there's also some in the Mediterranean as well. And what I want to touch on is the fact that President Trump has kind of been very focused on this issue. It has different responses in what is actually happening there. And so I want to take a step back to January 30th. There's a video here of him being asked about what's going to happen, and here's his response. And I want to give an updated response as well of what he said just a few, less than a day ago in on Air Force One in response to these questions, because Iran is basically trying to negotiate peace. They're saying this can be done diplomatically, but if you understand world history, you understand how these negotiations go with leaders and nations as this is kind of what they do. Of when they're weak, they negotiate for peace, but when they're strong, they don't negotiate. They just attack because they know they can, but what they're trying to do is buy more time and ultimately hoping that President Trump will be out of office. And that's kind of a card against Trump, is the midterms coming up shortly, and then also the end of his presidency. So if they can wait him out, help get somebody else in, or maybe the American people, without their influence, get somebody else in, then they can do it. But here's Trump's response to a question on the Iran issue and military assets being built up.
Are you giving Iran any kind of deadline to make a deal before potentially taking
Only
military action?
they know for sure.
I think that's key. He's saying only they know for sure. So they're trying to keep it quiet as far as what the deadline actually is, if there is a deadline, and that's Trump being Trump, the art of the deal.
Communicate that to them directly?
I have.
Does the president do you have a timeline for when you're going to pull back potentially the federal presence there?
No, we'll see how it all works out. You know, they have to float someplace. They might as well float near Iran. But
such a Trumpian
it's a
answer.
rough situation going on. So I stopped 837 people, as you know, last week from being hung. They were going to hang 830.
And this is an interesting point the media and around the world is not discussing, is the fact that they're still taking out their own civilians, and more so the civilians of Iran, as we're finding the ROGC is not necessarily Iranian. They're outside influences. It's the same thing you saw in Venezuela, where they were using Cuban forces to protect Maduro. The IRGC is a lot of former ISIS fighters from Syria, Jordan, and Afghanistan, other places. They're pulling them in.
It was all set, and I mean, I'm looking at the people behind me. They're saying, "What kind of racing's a lot nicer than that?" Right? They were going to hang 837 people, and I told them, if you do it, you're going to pay a price like nobody's ever paid before. And they pulled back. I appreciated that. But a lot of people are being killed, so we'll see what happens.
And so this is where Trump is at. He's being hardline in his actions, but then he's also trying to negotiate peace. If you recall, recently, he's been reminding people of all of the peace deals, 7 deals that he's made between other nations. And so he's trying to be a negotiator. He's trying to offer peace and mercy here, which is biblical. David would do this as the prime example, and Israel would do this, and Israel's done this with Gaza. And so we're seeing this play out here in these negotiations with Iran of offering mercy, offering grace here to try to get to the bottom line of doing, in his eyes, and to some degree our eyes, of what is best for the Iranian people, the Persian people, to be able to get their freedoms back. Now, recently, he's come out and given a harder deadline on this same topic when he was asked again in the White House. Oh, let me pull this up. Hold on. Sorry, apologies about that. One-man show today. Here we go. Let's play this.
Yeah.
You said today on Iran, bad things will happen if Iran doesn't make
really
a
bad
deal.
things.
What will that?
I'm not going to talk to you about that.
Okay, can you explain know, what is the goal if there is a U.S. military
Well, we
strike?
either make a deal or we're going to get a deal one way or the other.
But with a military strike, is it to wipe out their nuclear
I'm not going
program?
to talk to you about that, but we're either going to get a deal or it's going to be unfortunate for them.
And you said today 10 days. Have you given them a deadline firm to make a deal?
I would think that would be enough time, 10, 15 days, pretty much maximum. Yeah, I have to.
So he came out this weekend and said that 10 to 15 days, that's where things lie. The challenge will be is he's somewhat done this before and warned about if they go in and they hang and they start attacking and murdering their people, which they've already done. Similar to what Obama did of putting a red line in. Okay, if you go for nuclear weapons, this is what's going to happen. And then Obama didn't do anything. So is Trump going to follow on those steps? The rumored deal that Witkoff is talking about is that President Trump is trying to offer Iran the capability of keeping just civilian nuclear capabilities, but then taking out all military nuclear capabilities, which is just a dumbed-down version of the Iran nuclear deal that Obama put in place, which would be disastrous for the Iranian people to allow the tyrannical regime that is there. Somebody put it there. I heard that 60,000 don't know if that's correct. They didn't hold back. Oh, 60,000 people possibly. There's rumors of that. The problem is you don't know. That's a great question. We don't know the actual number of dissidents in Iran who have unfortunately lost their life because they've shut down internet for opposing voices within Iran. But that's a great point to bring up. It is upwards of 20 to 30,000, possibly more, depending on how the riots and things have been going within Iran. But for Trump's hard deadline, 10 to 15 days in the buildup, very similar to what you saw in Venezuela. And the question is, do they take out the leadership? Then who comes in? That's a long-term question. And then also, okay, if you don't take out leadership, do you start to go after military assets? If they know of nuclear capabilities, there is backing of if they don't, then Israel could make a move that Trump has said he would stand behind. But he's trying to get a deal made. Whether that falls through and actually holds up is yet to be seen. And if you understand history and these type of negotiations, it doesn't necessarily bode well for that red line not being enforced. And I think that's why I wanted to title today's On the Brink of War, because then the question becomes if you have this going on in our Western Hemisphere, you have that going on in the Eastern Hemisphere, there's fears militarily that we're being spread too thin. I think this is one where we're going to have to trust and then also pray that there's wisdom that comes in through this administration, through the Pentagon, of making sure you're not spread too thin. I think they're fully aware of that. I mean, even during World War II, when we have less military assets, you had military troops in U.S. military troops and assets in Europe, but then also after Pearl Harbor in the Pacific. So it's far-reaching, far wide. Does that hold true? Are they aware? Are they not asleep like Pearl Harbor and even October 7th? Are they awake? Are they, paying attention to this stuff? And then with what's going on in Mexico right now as we speak, this is what's happening now. Hopefully they are aware. Hopefully the Lord guides them through this, because this is far-reaching. I know for a fact that troops that haven't been moved overseas are being moved overseas for long-term deployment. Just say that. So major things to pray for is for us here. This is huge because we have an Air Force base and we have people who serve in our congregation and far-reaching and wide in our community. So we're praying for them. We're trying to be the best support as we can as we navigate this, because lives are possibly about to change in one way or the other. And so this is major affecting us here, but then also around the world as well. This will be far-reaching if something is done in regards to Iran. Now, well, the last few things I want to cover, I'll be short today, is the Supreme Court ruling that came down in regards to Trump tariffs. And I have a bit of a slow take on this that I want to walk through, because immediately as the ruling came down, Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, came out and basically was like, yeah, we were prepared for this. We knew this might possibly happen. And I know a lot of people are upset because it was a 6-3 ruling where Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett sided with Roberts in going in favor with the 3 liberal justices. And then you have the 3, I guess you would call them hard conservative, where you have Kavanaugh, Justice Thomas, and Alito siding against the majority and basically saying Trump had the right to do it, even though they were, in their dissents, they wrote some things that are kind of troubling, alarming, but we won't get into that today. That's me nerding out. But I will play this from Bessent, and then I want to play a clip from Ben Shapiro because he explains this and breaks this down of what's actually happening and what could happen. And Bessent agrees with him because he says it in another interview this weekend. So here's Bessent. I want to go back to right after the ruling, just so we all understand what's happening on the tariffs and what's the future of going on here for the Trump administration, because Trump's made this a big praise and a win for his administration and a windfall for revenues for America. So let's play this out. This is really important.
About what today's ruling was and what it wasn't. Despite the misplaced gloating from Democrats, ill-informed media outlets, and the very people who gutted our industrial base, the court did not rule against President Trump's tariffs. 6 justices simply ruled that IEEPA authorities cannot be used to raise even $1 of revenue. This administration will invoke alternative legal authorities.
And what's interesting about that is, okay, basically they're saying that you can't tax revenues that come out, but then also Roberts even eventually said that when you go back to the Obamacare ruling, that Obamacare is not a tax. And so either something is a tax or isn't a tax, but then you can't collect revenues. So it's a logical loophole that doesn't necessarily hold up. But the question is okay, what authority? Ultimately, this gets down to the authority of the president. This is challenging the authority of the president. They're saying basically he can't do it through this avenue, which we'll get
to replace the IEEPA tariffs. We will be leveraging Section 232 and Section 301 tariff authorities that have been validated through thousands of legal challenges. Treasury's estimates show that the use of Section 122 authority, combined with potentially enhanced Section 232 and Section 301.
So he'll get into that. I'm going to play another clip where he explains this. And what he's talking about here is the IEEPA. What they're talking about is how Trump tariffed other nations. Basically, that needs to fall down because it was infinite timeline that he could use that. Now, here's Ben Shapiro live reading. This is amazing, one, just as intellectually, but he's live reading the ruling and talking about this. And I think this will explain each ruling from or dissent from Kavanaugh, Thomas, and Alito a little bit better.
The Supreme Court struck down those Liberation Day tariffs today. The reality, as Kavanaugh points out in his dissent, is the president has a bunch of other ways to impose tariffs. He's got Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the president to impose a temporary import surcharge to deal with large and serious balance of payments deficits for 150 days. There's also Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 that provides that if the International Trade Commission determines that an article is being imported in such quantities that it causes serious injury to domestic industry, the president could take some action. Now, that does rely on the ITC. Section 301 allows the president to impose duties if he determines that an act, policy, or practice of a foreign country is unjustifiable and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. So that would be like unfair trade practices. So some of these tariffs could theoretically come back. And Kavanaugh points out that all the tariff revenue that has been collected is now in limbo. How does that, who pays that, right? Taxpayers paid the elevated prices.
So this is a great question. And Kavanaugh addresses it basically. What do you do with this revenue? Do you give it back to the companies? And then consumers go back to the companies and say, I want a refund? Do you let it play because that's what happened? Do you give the money back to consumers and skip the company? A lot of things at play, and Ben kind of gives his thoughts here.
People who are importing to the United States paid those prices. Where does that money go? The answer in all likelihood is that the money just kind of sits. That what's done is done. There's no redress that is available. Just going forward, the president can't use this sort of authority. So that is the breakdown. The markets are responding by not doing much because they don't actually know what's happening. Because no one knows what's happening. Is Trump going to let it die? What I think is a smart economic move. Impose targeted tariffs for specific reasons as a weapon of leverage. If Congress wants to pass big tariffs, go ask Congress for it. That's what I think that they should do. Or are they going to go whole hog. Will the Trump administration try to reimpose all these tariffs?
And I don't think necessarily Congress will tariff it. It's something that has to be done immediately fast. Congress is slow moving, and getting Democrats on board with something that would benefit Trump, that'd be hard pressed to actually see happen.
Right, that is the big question. Well, joining us on the line to discuss the legal...
So then he goes in to interview somebody. But then here you see Scott Bessent. I want to move to this one. He's interviewed this weekend on CNN, Face the Nation. I believe that's what this is called. And he gives the same address. And the reason I want to play this is because he's being consistent. What Ben said of how he's going to do it is very key here. But this was Scott Bessent's response here on CNN when asked about this question.
What is happening right now, which is the president did sign an executive order Friday night calling for that 10% global tariff, and then he raised it to 15% on Saturday. As you mentioned, he's invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to justify these new tariffs. That's a section of the federal law that no president has ever invoked. What does the president think will happen in the court, or why does he think it will stand up to legal scrutiny?
This 122 authority is good for 150 days. During that time, we will do study on Section 232, which will be done by Commerce Department, Section 301, which will be done by USTR. Those tariffs remain in effect and have withstood more than 4,000 challenges since the president's first term. So during that time, it is very likely that those studies will result in higher 232s, higher 301s, and it will get us back to the same tariff level. We've been in touch with our foreign trading partners, and all of them want to keep the trade deals that have been set. Dana, we've had great economic results over the past year, 4.1% second quarter GDP.
And the importance of discussing this, and why I really want to touch on this, is to make sure we're aware of what's happening, but then also understand that we're making sure we're not letting our anger causing us to sin, as Ephesians talks about. But more importantly is, I know a lot of people get upset with the Supreme Court and they're ruling this way, they're ruling that way. How dare they? Look, they're ruling based upon, one, the argument being made, but then two, the legal argument of what Trump's doing. And think long term. Think, okay, if Trump's not in office, okay, you would say Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, they're not just rubber stamping everything Trump sends their way. They're objectively looking at the case. They're seeing if this is the right way to do it. And it sounds like by what Scott Bessent is saying and how prepared he is, he kind of saw this coming because he might have known, he might have gotten overruled by President Trump. This is how President Trump wanted to do it, but he knew, long term, because this is kind of this is his world in international trade, in dealing with these type of things as he's dealt with this. So making sure we're grasping the reality of, okay, the Supreme Court is ruling properly, in the sense of Trump might have gone too far in just wide stretching, just going after nations and tariffing penguins on an island where there is no trade. And there's a reason why you would want to do that, obviously, to prevent China from using it as a place, a port, quote-unquote, to claim where this is where they're manufacturing and shipping all this stuff from, et cetera. There's arguments for and against it, and I like Ben Shapiro, and he's a non-tariff person, but even here he said in his video, he's like, look, if you're going to have tariffs, make them be specific for a specific reason where you can show that there is harm, and that's where this comes into play. Is Trump will have to show on case-by-case basis now, which he should, because if Trump were in office, you would want another president to do the same, whether it be Biden, Obama, etc. Making sure that if you're going to put a tariff on, that it be for a specific reason as to and showing how it harms U.S. trade and how there is an unfair trade practice being implemented against our companies internationally, and if they try to bring things here. So as we see this play out, we're seeing where somebody points out is the EU deal's not going to change because, as Bessent said, they did that trade deal and the tariff deal properly, and there are some others that he didn't. There's also, I saw reports this morning that talked about how the trade deals that were in effect, that are affected by this case from the Supreme Court, they're kind of put on pause as Trump figures things out. On Friday night, even in the State of the Union from CNN, they talked about there in that interview, I don't know if you guys caught it, where Trump Friday night, as this ruling came out last week, immediately started putting tariffs back on to countries where they could, as they're just moving as fast as they can. But it looked like Bassett understood this and saw this coming, which is a great thing. And the reason I say it's good to make sure we're not jumping up and down and getting upset with the Supreme Court is because it looked like this just happened this morning in regards to birthright citizenship and getting one step closer to getting this issue dealt with. And here's Trump this morning.
Powers and the rule of law in striking down the excessive use of nationwide injunctions to interfere with the normal functioning of the executive branch. The Supreme Court has stopped the presidency itself. That's what they've done. And really, it's been an amazing period of time this last hour. There are people elated all over the country. I've seen such happiness and spirit. Sometimes you don't see that, but this case is very important. I was elected on a historic mandate, but in recent months we've seen a handful of radical left judges effectively try to overrule the rightful powers of the president to stop the American people from getting the policies that they voted for in record numbers. It was a grave threat to democracy, frankly, and instead of merely ruling on the immediate cases before them, these judges have attempted to dictate the law for the entire nation.
I think this is a key point. So, in some people's eyes, the tariff ruling was not in favor of Trump, not in favor of the Constitution, not in favor of how things should have been. But from what my understanding is, and a lot of legal analysis, and I'm not saying I'm a legal scholar, but how I'm understanding this as far as the fair trade and implementation of tariffs, this is a healthy ruling on the tariffs, and this is also a healthy ruling when it comes to lower courts being able to just make nationwide injunctions. And this has to deal with specifically the birthright citizenship case, which is still kind of up in the air, but it's in favor of bringing up this topic and having it be dealt with. And there's a lot more that we'll say in the days ahead about this, as reading a book right now about some things that China's doing and even Mexico's doing that are allowing citizens to be made here that are actually nationals and citizens of other nations, their parents, etc., because they come here and they have their baby, so then their baby becomes a citizen of the United States, but then they go back. But we'll talk about that at a later date. And my point is the getting back to the balance of powers that the founders necessarily designed the country for within the three branches of government is preventing now. This ruling prevents them from saying, hey, I just get to make nationwide injunctions to make my decision and rule how I decide to rule. And Trump is challenging that, and in a positive way. And the Supreme Court is ruling in favor of that, saying, okay, you're not allowed to do this. This is the basics of what I'm picking up live in the moment here. So we'll look at this further this week and touch bases on it again next week on this birthright citizenship case. But as we're seeing this weekend, and Trump is continuing to move at a fast pace with this administration, the cabinet, and understood. And I think he learned a lot in his first administration. I think it's good for him to have learned those lessons and then this time be more effective. Now, is he perfect? Are the people he's putting in perfect? No, some have made major mistakes. But because he's a businessman, he's easily willing to just move on, cut the cord, and get somebody else in there who can do the job. Is everybody perfect? No. Don't want to say that. But this is why we want to pray. We need to pray. We're seeing what's going on in Mexico now with the possibility of Iran. And leading up to tomorrow night, if you're able to, tune in for the State of the Union as Trump gets ready to lay things out. Obviously, he'll be glowing, but I'm curious to see what his tone is on. Correct. Somebody put in here. I'm curious to see what his tone is on Iran and other issues. He's obviously going to be positive on the economy. Dennis puts in there, he said, I thought the Supreme Court ruled that these woke judges could not interfere. That's correct. That's what I was trying to say. Sorry if I was confusing, but yes, he did say that. They did say that, and that's the positive thing about that. So we need to continue to pray for the president, his administration, and their families and those involved. And especially if you know a military family, pray for them, because they're in limbo. They obviously more than likely can't tell you anything, but if we see what's happening with what President Trump's saying, understanding what just happened in Venezuela, seeing what's happening before our very eyes of the cartel's attacks in tourist areas in Mexico at a major international in Puerto Vallarta airport there, this is quite alarming, especially so close to our homeland here and more to us here, not to sound Russian or anything, but towards our southern border in Texas, and it hits home, I guess is a better way to say it, of, hey, this is not far from us, especially here in Shreveport in Louisiana, but then for a lot of people in Houston area, which Chuck has talked about is a major area of concern, of someplace we need to pray for. And so as we're following along, we're tracking the prophetic words, tracking what the Lord's doing, and then paying attention, like the sons of Issachar, of knowing the times and seasons that we're in, of being aware and moving how the Lord needs us to move. These are major issues that we want to continue to pray on. So thank you all for following us along. If you'd like to give, you can go to our website and or app and give directly to Pipeline or just our ministry at large. Help us continue the mission of making sure we're staying on the wall and being able to provide the resources that we need and support that we need to be able to continue to be watchmen on the wall, because without you, we would not be able to continue doing this. So we're very thankful and honored, one, that you follow us along, and if anybody gives, we greatly appreciate it and are honored for that. So with that, let's continue to pray for this administration, what's going on in Mexico, Iran, and even looking further, because this Iran deals long-term, because this isn't just with President Trump. This could affect future presidents and the balance of the world there. So blessings, and we'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.